take a bit of a trip through AI. I think many in the room, I've heard often from people when I talk about artificial intelligence that people are like, what is that? How do you use it? And fairly intimidated by the concept. The truth is, I hope when you leave this room, you will understand a lot more about AI, and it will actually stimulate some interest for you. By way of disclosure, I just want to acknowledge that two of the things that I'm going to talk about actually were supported in part by industry, and one of those has actually been licensed to GE Healthcare, who is currently marketing and selling it. The intellectual property is owned by the University of California Regents, as well as myself, and there are several provisional patents which cover this work. But really the goal is to actually try to inspire you guys to learn a little bit more about AI. So I think many people know that the United States, we have very expensive healthcare, but when you actually drill down into the data, it's actually quite startling. So these are the most current figures. I actually just went and got these. So we now spend $3.6 trillion in annual healthcare expenditures in the year of 2019. That's over $11,500 per US citizen. And that would be great if what you were paying for yielded value. But if you'll notice over on this life expectancy graph, if I could do this, right here, there's the US. Here's all the other developing nations, okay? So we're far off the bell-shaped curve. We have a lower life expectancy for the dollars that are spent than many other countries. And it turns out we're the only industry where you don't actually know what you're paying for, okay? So very difficult to understand this. I want to flip back a little more than 20 years ago. So the Therapies Human Report came out from the Institute of Medicine in 1999, and the goal of that report was really the beginnings of driving what we now know as value-based care. Almost simultaneous with this, about 6 months before the report came out, a group of Fortune 500 companies got together and formed the Leapfrog Group. Not Leapfrog toys that some of your kids probably play with, but an actual group of Fortune 500 companies that the goal was to leverage all of their employees' healthcare in order to drive healthcare expenditures down for the companies and improve life expectancy. It spawned a whole host of what I call the alphabet soup of regulatory, and you'll see them in that little alphabet soup there. And unfortunately, a lot of these things have not yielded the benefit that many thought they would. So this is a paper that I wrote to just show the residents in the room and inspire you can actually write impactful papers as a resident. So I wrote this as a mid-level resident. It appeared in the Annals of Surgery and has become really sort of a foundational piece of literature that shows really what can happen in regulation. This was actually published in March of 2016, so quite a while ago, a little under 15 years ago. And essentially what we said in this is that we felt surgery was likely to be a target of the value-based purchasing movement, and this is still in the very beginnings of it. And what's happened is that this is the kinds of things that people have focused on in the healthcare arena. The next slide just shows you a little bit about population health. So what is population health? So I'm a population health scientist by training. That's what the MPHS stands for at the end of my title there in the beginning. We tend to focus on things like the structure of how patients are cared for, so what type of institution are they cared for, who is their doctor, many of the things that you talk about in an M&M conference that you just had. We also talk about process measures. How is it that they were actually cared for, and how does that relate to their outcomes? So this is sort of known as the Donabedian model and framework of healthcare quality. But the truth is what we really care about is how people access their care, how much it costs, and what happens as a result of the care that they're provided. That is the gist of population health. And the idea is that we can leverage those things to actually overall drive down healthcare expenditures and improve life expectancy. So just a little snapshot, we're not going to go through these, but these are just 6 papers. There's probably 6,000 papers now, close to that the last time I looked, that have all taken this approach of this population health approach to quality. So how's it worked? What do you guys think? It's kind of worked, but kind of not worked. So here are some pretty staggering statistics. Since the Therapies Human Report came out, this September 2013 Journal of Patient Safety article was about 15 years after the other one was published, and it turns out that medical errors are still the 3rd leading cause of death in the United States, okay? So despite all of that money that's been spent on trying to actually make our care safer, we still have an epidemic of errors. We spend more in the year we're projected to spend more this year than we spent back in 2000 when the Therapies Human Report came out and the Leapfrog Group were formed. And that is when you correct for inflation. So when we put it in year 2000 healthcare costs, we are still spending more in 2020. So our costs are continuing to go up. And they actually are accelerating at a rate that is far above any other developing nations. And this is really, really importantly. This is some impacted by the opiate crisis, but for the last 3 years, the average life expectancy in the United States has fallen. This is the longest length of time since data has been collected on life expectancy that we've seen a decline in life expectancy in the US, and this is very startling and worrisome to those of us who work in the population and public health arenas. The one victory that people often quote is that infant mortality rates have fallen 14% over this time span. The problem is they're falling worldwide as well, and in the US, they're falling the slowest. So some victory here for us in terms of making care more accessible and safer, et cetera, but we're still not improving at the rate that other developing nations are. So why is this? So if you think about it, most of the work that we do in our research traditionally has really focused on the average treatment effect. If I do a clinical trial based on drugs and I go to report my results, I'm required when I submit that for publication to actually present what is the average treatment effect. But the truth is that very few of our patients are actually average, and most of what we treat is off the bell-shaped curve. The other piece of this is measurement is really hard. There are many of you in the room who actually work in health services research and outcomes work. It's actually really tough to measure things. So we're often left with measuring surrogate markers. And the truth is those surrogate markers have a lot of bias built into them, which makes it difficult to drill down on what are the key components that lead to differences in outcome. The other problem with this is it doesn't scale. We are confined by the ability of what data is available to us. And so you can't do a clinical trial and enroll thousands and thousands and thousands of patients unless you have a lot of money. So much of our work is focused on using administrative data sets and other registry types of data sets to try to glean outcome from it. And the truth is that there's so much bias built in that, it's very difficult. So I'm a data scientist. So Dr. Farmer introduced me and said I was the director of data science. 3.5 years ago, I got the very unique opportunity that there was an initiative that was starting around artificial intelligence and data science at UCSF, and they knew that I worked in the data science space and had for a number of years, and I got the opportunity to actually form and run this group, and you'll hear a little bit about the successes we had and what we're trying to do. But often people ask me, what is a data scientist? Well, it turns out that we don't have a uniform definition of a data scientist, and we all in the field argue about what are we, and there are a lot of people that have branded themselves as data scientists. I actually like the tweet over there. It's the best definition I've ever seen. So I am not a statistician, but I know sort of that blend of stats as well as computer science, and I sit in the middle where I have domain expertise. I know something about compute and IT infrastructure, and I know a fair amount about math and statistics. Each data scientist you meet is a mix of some piece of that, and the quantity of which they have is different. The reality is that data science gives us an opportunity to go out and harness all of the data that we've collected, both structured and unstructured. Unstructured data are things like your text-based notes or things that you freely write in our old charts of free text. Structured things are like a discrete blood pressure field. So what are we trying to do as data scientists? With this massive explosion of data that with everything in the world is now digitized, there's very few places where things in healthcare aren't digitized anymore. We're trying to actually take that data and figure out what the components of it are that could actually give us some signal that helps us figure out how to better care for our patients. I really like this little throwaway pamphlet, How Data Science is Transforming Healthcare, because look who's on the cover of this. It's surgeons, right? That's an operating room. And data science now permeates all parts of the operating room, from robotic surgery to the way that stuff is ordered for the operating room, et cetera. But what it doesn't do outside of robotics is actually be at the forefront of how we care for patients right now. So essentially what the data scientists are trying to do in combination with the population health sciences is really leverage this data to find that intersection where we can actually get to the heart of what we call precision health. So many of you have heard about precision health. Precision health doesn't just refer to the individual patient, but the ability to uncover the unique phenotypic variations across the spectrum of a disease process that allow us to figure out new ways to care for patients. That's the fundamental concept of what precision, or what some call now prescriptive health, is. Everybody knows this. Massive amounts of digital data. So we're just going to pause for a second, and I think these statistics are staggering. So I first gave a talk about data science and what a data scientist was back in 2015. And when I did this is an original slide from there, but the data has been updated. There were only 1.2 billion smartphones in the world in 2015. There are now 3.6 billion smartphones. If any of you realize what the population of the world is, that's essentially everybody has a smartphone, okay? And even in developing nations where they have poor other infrastructure, people still have a smartphone. Look at that, 5.6 billion searches per day that Google processes. That's a lot of learning about all of you. That's why you get the direct marketing when you're on Google and you Google something and then it keeps coming back to you every time you log into Google for a period of time. They're learning about your behavior. And my question has always been, if they can do this in our lives, why can we not do that for our patients? Just some more staggering statistics. You can choose your favorite out of here. I particularly like the 18.1 million texts that are being sent. I'm sure many of you are playing on your phones and texting right now. That's a tremendous amount of data, and we actually have some work where we can leverage some of this social media data to tell us something about the health of communities. So business has leveraged this. So Amazon, by full disclosure, they will not confirm this, but many of us in the field who work here have studied Amazon, lots of lessons to learn from Amazon and the way they do things. But essentially, how do they get that book to you so quickly? It's a little different now, but when they started in the parts of the country where they could get you the book the same time, it is because they have figured out that you are likely to purchase a particular book before you actually complete the purchase. So when they think that you're going to purchase the book based upon your behavior, they drop ship it before you've ever actually purchased it. And then there are different points along the way that they can pull it off of the production line if you don't complete the purchase in a certain amount of time. This one's scarier. Anybody know about the Target pregnancy predictor? I see some nodding heads, right? So a teenage girl, father is a famous journalist. Teenager starts getting direct marketing sent to them in the mail, so throwaway stuff from Target at the time. This is quite a while ago. And it was all for pregnancy stuff. Her father got very upset and reached out to Target and said, "Why are you sending pregnancy-related things to my teenage daughter? She is not pregnant." Turns out she was pregnant, okay? And that's how he figured out that she was pregnant. She had to confess, okay, before he wrote an op-ed story about this. And it turns out that they knew from her frequent shopper card at Target exactly what she was buying and figured out that she was buying things that were just like other pregnant women. But the really scary and interesting part about this is she bought nothing related to pregnancy that was obvious. So she didn't buy pregnancy tests, she didn't get anti-nausea medication. She was just doing normal consumer purchases. Okay, she didn't buy infant clothes. And so these groups have figured out how to use this data, and I would say compellingly, we should be able to do this for our patients. One other interesting thing, why does Netflix have so many hits? Anybody know? They know something's going to be a hit before you guys do, okay? So they study your behavior. They know exactly what their customers like to watch. So when they design a new series that they're going to make, they know it's going to be a hit before they've ever even filmed one episode because they know exactly what their consumers like. And our patients are consumers. So what's big data? So big data gets a bad rap. Lots of people have decided they don't like the title. But ultimately what we're talking about is really complex multimodality data that usually you can't individually collect yourself by hand. So these are automated, digitized data that comes to us. But fundamentally what I do is about prediction. And the key piece about prediction is if I can predict what's going to happen, can I figure out how to take care of you better so that something different happens to you? The best thing that would ever happen, in my opinion, is if I create an AI prediction algorithm and we identify targets for how we can care for you better, and the AI algorithm becomes not useful after a short period of time because we've done such a good job dealing with the issues that led to that outcome that we've actually improved your trajectory. A really important reason why AI algorithms, if they're going to be most effective for us, have to be continuously learning. But I want to talk about fidelity of data. So it's not just the amount of data we have. If that data that I get is voluminous and it has a lot of bias in it, my algorithm's going to be biased. And we've seen some spectacular failures of this, especially when it comes to racial diversity and disparities. So it's actually the value of the data, not necessarily the size of the data. I was fortunate enough to be one of the very first people founded through what used to be known as the NIH Big Data to Knowledge Initiative. This initiative was actually formed in 2013-2014 with the first funding coming in fiscal year 2014-2015, where they were really going to take this challenge on because AI didn't really fit anywhere inside the NIH. And they identified some very key structural things that they wanted to deal with, including data and tools, training gaps, et cetera, and then they funded key investigators around the country. This initiative is sundowning over the next year, and the reason it's sundowning is this has been such a successful initiative that this is now a mandate in all the NIH institutions to fund a certain portion of their work in AI. So just keep that in mind. So why is healthcare data difficult? This is not my slide. I borrowed this from Health Catalyst, but this is my favorite slide that I've ever seen about the complexity of data because it's quite simple in concept, but it's actually really, really important. And if you're going to do this kind of work, you have to address each piece of this. It's not just about how do I go get the data. It's not just about creating a data repository or a data warehouse. You have to actually be able to access it. You have to be able to assimilate it in a way that actually you can get value from it. There are huge parts of the regulatory requirements, which is a whole separate talk. If anyone's interested, someday I will explain it to you. But you have to really deal with all of these to be able to do this work. So what is AI, ML, DL? So artificial intelligence. So really key and fundamental. These are sort of a summation of definitions. We argue also about what these definitions are. But essentially, data science laps over into big data, and artificial intelligence is a piece of that. So artificial intelligence is the techniques that we use to actually get the value out of all of that data. And essentially, it's allowing us to use computers to mimic human behavior. So who in this room has done logistic regression? Almost everybody, right, has been involved in some project that does logistic regression. You have technically done AI, okay? So you can tell everyone, I've done AI, okay? That is a part of AI called machine learning. And the part with machine learning is essentially that we use statistical methods that enable computers to simulate human behavior, okay? So you'll see down here, ML, AI. These are some various different techniques. The names may be familiar to you for those of you who do research, but those are AI and ML techniques. And then deep learning, which in many ways in the lay press has become synonymous with AI, is actually a small portion of what we do. And that's where the computer can actually learn to autonomously come up with answers to questions when we feed it data and we teach it certain ways to do things, and then it evolves into being able to do it on its own. It's that simple, those definitions. So why now? So it turns out AI is actually not new. We coined the original field in the 1950s. And then there was great hope for this that went to the early 1970s. And there were some spectacular failures. So much so that the NIH and other funding agencies actually had a moratorium on funding AI research for a number of decades. Well, why is that? So anybody can see up there Moore's Law? Who is Moore? Does anybody know? Okay, founder of Intel. So this is Gordon Moore. Your nursing school is named after his wife, who was a nurse. Okay, so this is Betty and Irene Betty, and she goes by Betty, and Gordon Moore. I have the privilege of knowing them, and this is really, really important. So way back in the 70s, he said that the circuit ability, anybody ever take circuits or electrical engineering? Yeah, exactly. So those circuits that you used to play with and make, he said that the chips that what become now known as chips that we make, the compute capacity of those chips would double every 2 years, okay? That law has held true, and that's the graph you see there. That's the compute capability of those chips, which is now why you can carry around an iPhone or a smartphone that can do what it used to take a computer in the size of this room to do. So the reason AI had sort of these spectacular failures is the compute was too slow. So if I wrote an algorithm and it had to run, it could take days to run. I can now run that same algorithm on a small chip inside of a portable X-ray machine, I'll show you in a minute, in under 1 second. Okay, so think about that. So compute is no longer a limiting factor. So that's the primary reason why now. And the secondary reason is everything's been digitized. So what is the Smarter Health Initiative? 2 key things here. We're going after big, important topic areas that are either costly or pain points for patients and providers in the system. But importantly, we use real-world data. So there's a lot of examples in the literature about, I did this really cool thing with some medical data, but it turns out those are highly curated data sets that they start out with, and then when they turn their algorithm in the loose in a clinical environment, they don't work, okay? So we use real patient data, real world data with all of its messiness. I would just say the caveat, because this hit the news yesterday, that there are all these medical centers that are selling access to data. We have everything protected, so I want to emphasize that, and we don't sell our data. As the University of California, we cannot sell our data. You have to develop a system to do this. So it's not just that we're off in a lab. This is team science. It requires lots of people. So we have to have partners on the compute side that provide us with the ability to do the kinds of work that we want to do. You have to have a phase of where you do pilot validation, just like any other research that we do on a foundation of a strong research platform. And then if you're going to go out and you're going to actually deploy it, you need two things. You need your health system that has an ability to get it back into the environment for the patients. Otherwise, it remains in the literature as a very interesting piece of literature. So that interoperability piece is really important. And if you're going to scale to affect healthcare worldwide, you have to have partners that you can deploy with. Those are some of our partners. So what are the kinds of things that we work on? So there are 8 key principles here. We have focused in our program at working at the point of care. And what, for us, the point of care can even be in the outpatient environment, but it's where the patient interacts with the healthcare system. And you can go everything from improving this for access to care all the way to actually creating new treatment pathways. And I'm going to show you just a few key examples of this relatively quickly, primarily to stimulate people in the room to think about what's possible. So this is real patient data from one of my patients at San Francisco General Hospital. This is an ICU patient. These are 3 different sets of markers that we gather. This is a 36-hour period of time that you see up here on this. And what I would tell you is that my human eye cannot see a pattern there. And I would bet nobody can see a pattern there, right? But AI can see a pattern. It can see what we don't see. And so what we call physician intuition, I firmly believe, is that we are picking up on signals that we don't even understand we're seeing, and that's what contributes to physician intuition. And people go, how did you know that? You saw something that wasn't obvious to everybody else, okay? So AI, this is the key. We're trying to find the signal, the critical signal, in a lot of noise. So here's one example. So that patient data I just showed you has been converted to this for some of our patients. So these are all emergent intubations over a year period of time from UCSF's main hospital. There are 6 ICUs there. It's data on all 6 ICUs. The patients were actually looked back at, and they were looked to be quantified as an elective intubation versus an emergent intubation. An emergent intubation being those that were not predicted, were not planned, and required over a very short period of time. And it turns out we can change that messiness that I just showed you into figure 1A over there, a very, very simple trajectory that progresses. And I can predict out to 50 hours, about 48 technically, before someone's intubated, who's likely to be intubated. The next obvious question should be, well, that's great, but can you do anything about it? And that's the next piece of the secret sauce. So some of our collaborators, this is a relatively old study now, but it's been turned into a commercial product called the Hero Symphony. They took 3,000 neonates that were underweight, multi-center trial, randomized control trial, and randomized them to this Hero score, which is essentially some physiologic components, including heart rate variability, displaying it to the providers or not displaying it to the providers. And essentially when the providers would walk in the morning in the neonatal intensive care unit, they would say, this person's Hero score doesn't look so good, we should start rounding there. So the only fundamental change that they made in the way they cared for these patients in this randomized control trial was simply the order in which they rounded. And they chose who they were going to round on based upon those who had a Hero score that looked bad. And the mortality fell precipitously. They did nothing else. So essentially all they did was focus attention on a signal, okay? And so the hazard ratio of death in these very low birth weight kids fell to 0.74. That's pretty significant decrease. And if you think about all the other things that we've done in critical care trying to drive down mortality rates, something as simple as alerting us and rounding differently has had a pretty profound effect. And that difference in mortality continued out to 120 days after randomization. Because remember, these neonates have long hospital stays, okay? So you can design therapies. This is some work from my translational and basic science lab, and you see, you don't really have to know that much about it, but this is about coagulation, and you see there's 3 different groups here. So these patients, all by traditional measures, would look coagulopathic, and in the past, we would treat them all the same way. But we've actually uncovered that there's some phenotypic variation in these patients, and each of these patients needs something unique. And when you treat them and you graph whether they live or die, when you treat them all the same way, it looks a little messy, kind of looks like one of those eye pictures, what do you see in here? But you'll notice the dark dots, which are the people who are dying, they're clustering towards one type of phenotypic variation. This allows you, within a context of what appears to be coagulopathy, allows you to drill down on who those people are and actually give those phenotypes a different care. This is another way of looking at it. You don't have to know anything fancy. This is a super learner technique developed in partnership with our UC Berkeley colleagues. This is a machine learning technique where we actually can analyze data and figure out at what different point in the physiologic state space that patients are in, what are the components of therapy that we're providing that are actually changing the way that patients' outcome is. So what you see here is 24 hours, 48 hours, and 72 hours for multi-organ failure and mortality, and you can see different things matter at different points in time. And the part that's key about that is when you decide a treatment at time 0, you have to continue to evaluate and evolve with those patients. But our current approaches to figuring out outcome for these patients are based on very linear, discrete variables. Okay, so this allows us to figure out different ways to care for different people. And Francis Collins was director of NIH, said this back in 2010. It's not enough that we have therapies for patients that could actually help them get better. We have to actually know who benefits, and that's why this individualized therapy is so very important. So this is a focus of a lot of the research that I do in the lab. So anybody here heard of a learning health system? Yeah, it's sort of the buzzword right now. So what does it actually mean? It's pretty simple. It means taking everything we can get about the patients that we already know and looking at how they did. So this is all retrospective and eventually becomes prospective. Drilling down into it using our sophisticated AI and ML techniques and figuring out a prediction of who did what when, so phenotypic variation, and then using that to feed back into the system so that we can continue to care for people and evolve to what we call optimized state. So essentially what that means is we take a lot of data and we use what we know about the patients, what we've learned, and we actually operationalize that in a feedback loop so that we can figure out who's on trajectory and who's off trajectory so that we can actually prescribe very specific therapy for them. I'm not the only one who does this kind of work. There's several of us out there. The military is particularly interested in this, especially for triage. Here's two very simple examples. So this is a bleeding in silico study, which means a simulation study, computer simulation study. When they gave practitioners data, this is how much fluid was given by the practitioners. You see all the variation there? Tremendous variation. If you give the computer the same information, the computer still has some variation, but has far less variation and gets people back to a normal cardiac output faster. And when you combine the two, the variation is even better, is even less, okay? So this is sort of giving people hope that these precision-guided resuscitation strategies are really where we're headed. This is a really interesting paper published back in 2014, so it's a little bit old now, but they were able to actually figure out by putting on people who were deployed, they could actually figure out whether they were exercising or whether they were bleeding based upon their hemodynamics. And this is down here, all the exercisers clustered there, and this is what happens with their algorithm when they think the patients are actually bleeding. This allows them to better triage the patients. So another sort of switch away from sort of resuscitation and trauma. This is a really interesting example that I showed to show what the power of social media data is. So you can use this for resource activation. So these are 4 U.S. disasters. We restricted it to the U.S. because for a very specific reason. And we were trying to create an early warning detection technology for trauma centers to better triage their resources when one of these happens. So the Boston Marathon bombing up there, the Napa earthquake, Marysville school shooting, in San Francisco, Asiana plane crash. We did this, we wanted different types of disasters. And does anybody notice, does this all look like a similar tweet signature? So this is quantity of tweets immediately after. There's a very clear signal here in how we as humans respond to it. And the question was, can you use that to actually create earlier warnings for healthcare systems to actually provide them an earlier warning than the county disaster pages? So it turns out you can. So where the arrow is right here, it would be where our signal that we developed fires. And that dark red line is when the county disaster page goes out. So there's about a 12-minute lag time here. That may not seem like a lot. For those of us who work in disaster management, 12 minutes might make all the difference in the world for us actually organizing our teams properly. And then you got to test it. So we then went and got, in real time prospectively, we built a system to pirate the tweets, working with FEMA on this. And we got all the tweets on the day of the Super Bowl when it was in San Francisco so that we could test our signatures. So we got 55 million tweets. The green line you see there is called a moving average. And despite a very public event where you might have similar words to which we built the signal on, the signal does not fire. And that includes when a California Highway Patrol officer was injured and there was a lot of activity in social media around that, our signal still doesn't fire. So we can show you that this is a negative control. The problem is it's very difficult to do this prospectively as a positive control, but others have gone on to use this. And not only that, but I can actually figure out where you are when you're tweeting in real time. So this is these are screenshots in real time that would have been done in real time that we extracted from the Asiana plane crash. So you can see Sacramento, you see San Francisco, you can see where all the traffic is. I can drill down, oh, they're all coming from the airport. Oh, look, that's one these are on the runway. Those are people who were actually on the planes, okay, that were on the runway. I can see what they're tweeting. So if one said, help, come help me, I can send resources directly to that. And then I can even find someone in the boarding area D, and I know exactly where they are. People have used this technology to get people resources in disasters around the world. So I'm going to end up for the last couple of minutes talking about how an example of expediting workflow, how you take something from interesting science all the way to product development. So this is obviously a pneumothorax that you see up there. This automated that you see here is us teaching the computer how to identify what's the right lung, what's the left lung, and it can do it with pretty good accuracy. So that's what we draw on it to tell it, and that's what it learns after thousands and thousands of x-rays. Chest x-rays. So one of the people who worked on this with us actually said, isn't it interesting that AI technology is being built for the oldest radiology technology that exists out there? When we first started working on chest x-rays, people told us, why are you doing that? People were not interested, okay? But the reason we were interested is that this is a major workflow problem in the United States. Everybody orders chest x-ray stat. Every single ICU chest x-ray is ordered stat, right? And when you have a patient who's really doing poorly and you really need the x-ray, 5 phone calls later, they show up to take the x-ray, right? So it's a real problem. And outside of the United States, chest x-rays are the lowest priority, so they are read last. So in some countries, it can take a median on average of 8 hours for a chest x-ray to be looked at. And in some places where radiology resources are very limited, it can be more than 24 hours before these are looked at, okay? When a radiologist looks at this many chest x-rays, they do a really good job. When they look at this many, they do not as good of a job, okay? Despite what they might tell you, they don't. And what we're trying to do is in real time find the 3 or 4 or 5 x-rays that have a finding on them, move them in real time to the front of the queue continuously as the x-rays come in so that the radiologist looks at this quicker. That's the workflow piece of it. For us as clinicians at the bedside, in the ICU, the ER, the OR, wherever, we're trying to develop technology that you can actually see in real time, not to replace the radiologist, but to draw your attention to things that could be important in the moment before the radiologist has a chance to look at the film. And we've done it. So we can automate the location of an endotracheal tube. So that's an endotracheal tube where the blue is honing in. That's right main stem intubated. That can pop up right on your screen in the prototype versions of this, right on the portable x-ray machine when this is taken, and you can immediately see it rather than us squinting on the small screen saying, what is it? Is it there? Is it not there? We can actually automate the detection of where the carina is. The black dots are the ground truth. The white is what AI has drawn, so for the carina and where an endotracheal tube is. We can find critical findings. This is some preliminary work done by one of our colleagues we partnered with for the pneumothorax, for the largest size of them. We can find free air under the diaphragm and draw your attention to it, often missed on upright chest x-rays. But that's not enough, okay? You gotta get it to a product. So interesting, this is the GE x-ray machine that was used in the show ER, and so that's George Clooney who signed it and some of the other stars at the end of the show and returned to GE. When I tell people that we were going to design something for a pneumothorax, they say, great, but how does it work and how do I know does it work? And what we talk about in AI often is that things are a black box. You don't know how it got to its answer. I said that's not good enough. We have to build trust with our colleagues. So we've actually removed the black box. So the top that you see up there is our AI generated where it thinks a pneumothorax is in the 3 different sizes, very tiny, small, and kind of moderate. And down here that you see is the ground truth. And you can see that the AI can actually do really well. So if I show you this on an x-ray and you can toggle back and forth, see it and not see it, you're going to have a lot more confidence in interpreting that, okay? You got to have a way to deploy it. So if we're just going to run one AI application in a compute infrastructure scheme, and that runs on the computer, on the mainframe of the computer or in the radiology resources through the cloud or however on a server, that's fine. But when we have thousands of these, they will slow down our system. So we made a very clear design choice that we would embed the logic in the X-ray machine. So a new X-ray machine has to be built. So Intel built a chip. So this now functions as its own AI. And you can see here what comes off is actually where this location of this is, as well as a confidence interval. It'll tell you I'm 95% sure that this is a pneumothorax, or I'm 80% sure this is a pneumothorax, to give you as the clinician some opportunity. And then this is it reprioritizing in real time. This is now FDA cleared, and this is the first bedside AI embedded application that the FDA has used for a digital therapeutic. This is us doing some feedback. So this is me meeting with the engineers. They don't understand what we do. So if you're going to do this kind of work, you have to partner with them so when they engineer stuff, it actually goes the right way. This is us getting customer feedback a year before this was launched, and there will be 4 applications in the first version of this and more subsequent to come. We're doing this all in the face of new regulations. So when we started this project 3.5 years ago with the chest, or 2.5 years ago with the chest X-rays, it was very unclear what the pathway was for regulatory approval. We figured we would need FDA approval, but when you're doing this in an evolving science and an evolving field, you have to stay cognizant of this. And the regulations have changed a lot from beginning to end. So I like this slide. What's going to need regulatory approval? Question mark. We still don't quite know, and we were sort of first in many capacities to the finish line for this. There have been AI-approved things like your Apple Watch that they have heart rate, they have approval for that, but that's a consumer purchased and used device. Actually, inside the hospital, this is the first, okay, from the FDA. And we fit in the digital therapeutics category. This is where physicians will be using the AI-powered algorithms to actually influence their decision-making. That clearly is going to need FDA approval for the time being, and post-market surveillance. Digital medicine, that's curious. These are things that are clinical decision support aids where you may or may not be using them to make clinical decisions, but they're running in the background. This is where we don't know if these will or will not need approval. And then just collecting digital data clearly doesn't. This is why it's so important. This is sort of the hype part of this. So these are non-healthcare examples, but we don't want someone to be able to write an article about this. I think one of the important things here is people don't even realize that the self-driving car that hit and killed someone, everybody knows about that, right? There was one before that. There was the very first autonomous van, which is up here. It got in an accident on its very first day. So why is that? That's that whole concept of using real-world data. So classic example, they took and they trained those cars based on stop signs. They showed them perfected stop signs, right? How many times do you drive around and see a perfect stop sign? You don't. It's bent, part of it's torn off, part of it's missing. Turns out if you change all that stuff, it won't recognize it as a stop sign anymore. So that's why real-world data is really, really important with its messiness. So here's us. This is the actual device. It really does exist. Coming off, this is one that just came off the factory line, and this really is the future. Not because we're involved in this product, but you will see more and more and more of these. And it's actually been deployed. So once you do these, it's not good enough to just say, yeah, I have FDA approval. I firmly believe you need post-market surveillance to make sure that what you invented works the way that it's intended, because there's a lot of risk here, especially for life-threatening conditions. It's been deployed. This is a tertiary care center in India where there was a pre-existing relationship, so that's why they helped out. And you can see it's finding even very, very tiny pneumothoraxes, and so it's working pretty well. There are some false positives. There are some false negatives. This is a very important paper. I know none of us in this room are radiologists, but this will become a guide for all of us who read and do AI. I'm not going to go through all of this, but to say that this was just published on December 30th. Prior to December 30th, 2019, there were no groups that had come out and said, what are the standards for doing this work? And so when you do this work, you have to be really, really careful, and we firmly believe that we should do these based on a foundation of science. So importantly, validation is a really important piece, and I'm going to explain what that is in just a second. So how many of you heard all the spectacular news about the mammography? A lot of nodding heads, right? So this just came out. So this is a landmark study, industry funded by Google. That's okay, but you just have to understand that, where they actually took an AI system, and the headlines are that AI outperforms the radiologist. Not actually what the paper showed, okay? So I'm here to caution you that what they did was they developed an algorithm in the UK. In the UK, does anybody know how mammograms are read in the UK? They're read by 2 radiologists. 2 independent radiologists read. How do we do it in the US? 1 radiology read. So it turns out the AI performs exactly like 2 radiology reads, okay? And it does better in the US than 1 read. So that's why circumstances are important. And in the US group, fairly, It drove the false negatives down and the false positives down. That's great. This is an example of what AI can do. This is a box that AI generates to draw the radiologist's attention. These turned out to be cancers. Those were missed by all 6 human readers that were in the study. So the AI does better than 1 human reader, but does the same as 2 readers. And here's the other caution. So we've graphed this against what the 9 criteria are that radiology, the leading people in radiology have said we should do. And this study only meets 4 of those 9 gold standard criteria. So when you read these AI papers that are very exciting, I want you to read them with caution. It's a great technology, but it still has a ways to go. This is a $36 billion industry, okay? AI-generated healthcare. That's why I want you guys to all understand that this is forthcoming. It's great that we've made some invention, but that's like feeder fish. Everybody else is in the race for this. When we first developed this 2 years ago and we were working on it, there were 25 companies at the National Radiology meeting that were working in the AI space. The next year there was 126, and this year there were over 300 startup companies. So there's a lot of stuff coming. You got to know how to validate and understand what's important. Of the 516 studies that have been published in our literature, only 6% of them included a validation data set. For other things like randomized controlled trials and other predictive scoring systems that we use, we wouldn't accept that. We would say you need a validation data set, but we're accepting this lower standard in AI, and that's not good for us. So we're in this hype cycle. We're at the peak of inflated expectations. And if we aren't careful about instituting these, we will very quickly be in the trough of disillusionment where people say this stuff doesn't work. It does work, but you have to do it the right way. So here's what you should think about, the take-home points, if you're going to read AI and you're going to institute it in your system. What actually went into informing the data model? The mammography example is a perfect example. What was the gold standard comparison? Was it a human reader? Was it multiple human readers, et cetera? Was it validated in an external environment? Did they take it out into the wild and show how it produced before they exposed patients to it? Or was it based on computer simulation, which a lot of those 516 studies are? Or was it actually done in the clinical environment with real-world data? And what is it comparing? Is it comparing us as clinicians to an algorithm, or is it comparing us plus the algorithm to just us? Okay, important considerations in how you operationalize. Did anyone do a prospective trial of AI? There are 0 of these, okay? So we have one right now currently enrolling, but there are 0 prospective trials, but these are what are forthcoming. And how do you deploy it, and has it been post-market surveyed? Why does this matter? There's some pretty good economic analysis of this that show if we use this technology to really push forward the way that we care for patients, we could save almost $300 billion per year in the healthcare system, an astronomical amount of money that could do really important things for us. This is hard work. I stand up here on the shoulder of hundreds of people who've contributed to this work, and I just have the privilege of leading this group. So I get to do all the great presentations about it, and they do all the really hard work. But you have to have partners. This is the ultimate team science. None of us are going to go off and do this singularly in our own lab, and so you've got to get the right people to the right table. And this is just a few of the many people who have contributed to this. And the person in the center right here in the cap and gown is the inspiration for why I do this work. She was a patient of mine who we created a pathway for that was outside of the norm. And we took a lot of criticism for this. And by all the measures of population health and all the studies, she would have died of her ARDS. She survived after catastrophic injuries and returned to graduate from Johns Hopkins 4 years after the neurosurgeon sat with her parents and told them that she would never wake up. So there are things that we don't know about patients and their individual biology that really guides whether people do well or do poor, and you can figure it out if you find the signal. So with that, I want to thank you all for your attention and the warm invitation to be here, and I'd be happy to answer questions. Yeah?
I looked at the same data on life expectancy, and besides it being horrific, right?
Yeah.
What do you think is the real reason why they do it better in the UK than we do? Because we learn about the same physiology.
Yep.
Because I have my own ideas. I think there's way too many people doing things however they want in this country.
Correct.
The UK, that's a big part of it.
Yeah, so that's definitely it. So there's a lot of what we do in the way that we deliver healthcare that is not evidence-based, that is, my last patient did well, so I'm going to do this, or I'm fearful of my last complication, so I'm going to try to redo something completely different. That's not guided by evidence. That's part of it. The other part, which is important to acknowledge, especially in an innovation talk, is that the R&D development in the worldwide, the vast majority of it is billed through United States entities, so that goes against our healthcare expenditures. So we've got a lot of failures in R&D, and there's actually a tremendous amount of interest. I've talked to every pharmaceutical company through my role. They all want to repurpose their old data that they spent a lot of money on to find new therapies, and we probably will be able to do that. And so getting to the answer of what's best, faster, will also drive that healthcare costs down. There's a lot of disparities in the United States, and that in some of those countries that are on there, they have much more uniform populations than we do, and so that probably contributes to in part, but a very complex issue, but a great question.
Love the talk.
Thank you. Yes?
Very wonderful work, and very complex and highly productive. I guess the question I have is going back to the X-ray AI, and obviously AI has the ability to maybe reduce the amount of healthcare applied, say in mammography or even something like lung cancer screening.
Yep.
But in those chest X-ray examples, did it change medical management that led to invasive procedures that those patients may not have needed, right? Because not everyone with small, tiny pneumothoraces need chest tubes or other invasive interventions.
Fabulous question. So what is the unintended consequence of doing this, right? So that's part of the reason for the prospective trial ongoing, where India is the first. Thus far, looking at it, they have been surprised that they have found stuff that the radiologist overlooked because it's being done by a radiology group who said we don't need this. So we're just cautioned that they're finding things they didn't need to find. My lab has an ongoing project actually around pneumothorax, and it's not just good enough to detect it, but can we figure out who will progress or not progress to drive therapy? So that's the next piece of it. And then the third piece of it is there have been some retrospective look at some data, some chest x-rays that resulted in lawsuits where patients died or had major complications as a result of a missed pneumothorax, which we all like to think is rare, but it's not, even in the US. And in every single one of those cases, this algorithm found it, where it was overlooked by the clinician. So from that perspective, we think it's working well. I think the prospective trial will show us, because we're not arguing anything about how they should be cared for. We're just drawing attention. And that next piece of the digital therapeutic about actually selecting the treatment is the part that the FDA is most concerned about, as are we, and we don't know the answer to that yet. Yeah?
Thank you. Great talk. So most of the examples that you provided were basically like in the inpatient setting and like involving radiology. A few years ago, I read an article that they used a Google search of certain patients to predict pancreatic cancer.
Yep.
Is there like more work on this topic, and has this been applied to other diagnoses?
Yeah, so there's a lot of work in leveraging out of the hospital data in order to speed up what I would call the lead time bias to knowing of diagnosis. So groups like Google, there's a movement by Amazon. A lot of this is coming, there's partnership with Roche and GE. A lot of the commercial entities are driving that sort of pathway forward. The reason the commercial entities are more in that business than the academic centers are in that business is because the quantity of data that you need and the complexity of the data that you need to drive that are very hard for a single academic center to get their hands on. And so our group is about to launch an initiative that's going to allow that, make that easier with some new technology development. But that is why they're leading the way, and there's definitely examples of that. The other piece that we often don't talk about is I think patients, we often rely on the patients to figure out they need to be a patient, right? But there's so much that happens outside of the hospital where I could actually apply some of these techniques to be able to figure out whether or not and help you know when you need to come see us as physicians. And there's some work happening in that arena as well. Yeah.
How does this transform into high value care? You talked about at the beginning, but a lot of these initial are new technologies that cost a lot of money. And how does that actually circle back to create value?
Yeah, another excellent question. So one of the key design choices for us in at least the X-ray example is that we wanted the barrier to entry for people to be able to use this to be relatively low. So this X-ray machine costs within $1,000 what the old X-ray machine without the technology was, and requires no new infrastructure. So it can be deployed worldwide, even in low-cost settings where they don't have a lot of money. But that was a clear design choice. Some of the AI that's being developed right now actually is very expensive and requires infrastructure pieces to it, and we've been fairly vocal in the community that that's not the way to do this for people. So that's sort of the expense piece of it. The expenditure piece and the healthcare value is we're pretty certain that it's going to make care safer. We need to make sure it doesn't have the unintended consequences of driving us to do more testing. So far, it seems like it doesn't. The mammogram example is a pretty good example of how they can drive down the false negatives and the false positives. And we think that it's going to make care more efficient and safer, which ultimately will drive healthcare costs down and potentially actually speed up the development of R&D to better targeted therapy. So CAR T cells, does anybody know what a CAR T cell is? So CAR T cells, very popular right now. Every pharmaceutical manufacturer has one. It costs $250,000 for some of the CAR T cells, $100,000 to $250,000 a month for those people to be on that therapy, and we have no idea who benefits from the therapy. So techniques like this may select those patients better so that we're not expending money that has no value for patients. Yeah.
Hi. I think one of the primary concerns for physicians when talking about AI is the potential loss of our autonomy.
Yeah.
And to Dr. Graf's point, and our biases, maybe too much autonomy is not a good thing. In a lot of the neural networks I've looked at, the training and testing sets often have like AROCs of 0.95 and 0.96, and they look great. Then you run your validation set, and it's like 0.76 or so. Yeah. So where do you see, I guess, physician autonomy playing into a receiver operating curve that isn't perfect, and some medical legal implications of that down the line if we decide to go against what the algorithm's telling us?
Yeah. So our chair of radiology, Chris Hess, just spoke at an American Bar Association conference about this last week, and the thought around this is that if you use an FDA-approved regulatory device that's AI-powered, you will have a defensible position if you use it and there's a bad outcome for a patient. There's a lot of centers, some big centers out there investing hundreds of millions of dollars in AI who are designing and developing things only for the use in their health system. There's probably more risk there, okay, for exactly what you talked about. That's why the real-world data piece is so important. Most of those things that you've looked at with those AUC curves that are so good, those are highly curated data sets that do not reflect reality, okay? So we're basically reinventing the wheel of a highly confined randomized controlled trial and not really leveraging the value of using the data. So for an example, in the when you first run that paper I showed about AI, it was a great initial paper from some of our colleagues that we worked with on moderate and large-sized pneumothorax. I said, that's not good enough, because all the small and the tiny ones are the ones that we're worried about, right, progressing. And so that's not going to be good enough, and their AOC was not fabulous. The product that actually ultimately came through iteration of many different real-life data sets, teaching the computer arms down versus arms up, flipped the wrong way, all of those things are in our data set. Underexposed, overexposed, the AUC curve, depending upon where we set the threshold, because that's actually a manipulatable thing with AI, is somewhere between 0.92 and 0.99 for the final product. That's what we have to get to in order to be able to use these things, in my opinion, in our tertiary care centers. Out in the developing world, where they don't have us, where we aren't there, and they have nothing, if you have no read, a read with an AUC of 0.8 is better than nothing. So it depends on what your environment is. Someone had a hand over here.
Yeah, I've great talk, fantastic talk. I have two questions. The first is when you're implementing these AI, policies, do you need IRB approval because it's taking in data and applying it continuously? And then the second question is how do you see alert fatigue playing into this, and how can we kind of prevent that as we get more AI pop-ups and alerts and put your eyes here?
Right. So everybody's chasing a sepsis algorithm. You notice I didn't say anything about sepsis up here. Every manufacturer of every device is chasing a sepsis alert. I suspect in the current state that they're going to be very similar to the epic sepsis alert you get now that you just ignored, right? So alarm fatigue is an issue. In actually deploying the product, you got to know your customer. So you got to actually go out and talk to the people who are going to use this, talk to the clinicians, talk to whomever is going to actually be using it. And everybody has a different threshold. My threshold in the ICU is very different as a critical care intensivist or in the ED versus the radiologist. The radiologist doesn't want 50,000 errors. I sure would rather have an error of an alert and not overlook something than not be alerted. So it's a really tough question to get at. So how do you get around it? Again, you got to test them in the real world. The second thing is that you have to make sure that they are addressing an issue that's important to the patients or providers or the system, such that people are invested in the outcome, right? So the radiologists don't care that we're doing this, right, for chest X-rays because they don't like reading them. Okay, so an assisting device for them works. So that's part of it. I think we'll have a bunch of these, and then we'll have drop off and fallout, and we'll eventually get to a steady state. Yeah.
And I think there was part of Alicia's question that wasn't
Yeah.
about what about these
Replacing us?
go against what the algorithm says to do based upon their
Yeah.
clinical judgment.
Yeah.
What
So.
will happen to them?
The question is, what happens if you go against the AI judgment? It's not clear yet whether the AI result will be saved in the electronic medical record at the present time. So we pirate them off the device that we know, but whether or not it remains a part of the PACS record at your individual institution is an institutional decision, and the legal folks have not given an opinion yet on what that means. I think fundamentally we have protocols already, and we choose to treat people differently that we think don't adhere to a protocol, and there's almost no cases of people being sued for that when you say this person doesn't apply for this protocol. So I think if you're within the standard of care, we're probably still going to be okay.
Great. All right. Thank Dr.